I'm Jeff Macher. I'm a professor here in strategy, econ, and policy. This is joint work with John Mayo. I'm self-timing myself. It's a long day. Yeah. So this paper is preliminary and incomplete, but it's something that came out of last year's research colloquium and something that John and I are delving into over the summer. This is, as I mentioned, pretty preliminary and incomplete, but let me give you an idea of what we're doing. So this is one of my favorite charts of all time. When one looks at the freight rail performance post-staggers, one sees amazing increases in productivity, in volume, decreases in revenue over time and rates, with some movement up in the later parts. But by all respects, and even by the Senate report, the most successful rail transportation legislation ever produced, resulting in the restoration of financial health to the rail industry. When I teach regulatory economics course, this is one of the charts that I go to as to how beneficial deregulation can be in a particular industry. So from that perspective, shippers were made better off, railroads were made better off. And what I want to do is really focus on one specific part of the Staggers Act, which dealt with contracts. So Section 208 did many things. It expedited complaint processes. It allowed confidential contracts between shippers and railroads. It prohibited regulatory challenges to approved contracts, and while providing some future restrictions to ensure some common carrier obligations were met on the part of railroads. Now, the early assessment was generally pretty positive here as well. An ICC study in 1984 indicates contract rate making is proven to be one of the more successful deregulatory measures provided by staggers. And then a later report, the same report on a separate page, contracting was mutually beneficial to railroads and shippers. And this has been widely studied, and the main arguments that have been put forth is it allows for greater predictability and stability in some of the businesses, some flexible pricing on the parts of shippers and railroads, tailoring to meet individual shipper needs, and confidentiality, which may or may not be important in some respects. So, what happened? Well, over time, there was a humongous push into contracting. So I'm looking at the carload weigh bill sample in data that's been ton-mile adjusted, roughly 20% of the contracts in, say, the mid-1990s or early 1990s to roughly 80% of carriage of ton miles is under contracts now. And that's a pretty big jump. But that doesn't really answer the story if you look at it by commodity. So if you disaggregate the data by the two-digit STCCs, the Surface Transportation Commodity Codes, you see sort of a different story. Farm is roughly 20 to 25% over time in terms of ton-mile adjusted contracts, whereas some other things in the middle, like food, is somewhere into the middle, and then some of the higher ones, miscellaneous mixed and coal in particular, as well as metal ores, almost all of it is via contracts. So that, to me, is interesting. When there's heterogeneity, I think I can use econometric methods to help tease that heterogeneity out. So over time, John and I had talked, and we thought what might drive differences in contracting. So we thought maybe STB rate reviews might be somewhere to look at. If you look at the literature on rate reviews, there has been arguments made that they're complex, time-consuming, and costly. So for instance, a GAO study in 1999 looked at the standalone costs, that its time, complexity, and costs of filing complaints are barriers that preclude, here they were looking at shippers, but that's not necessarily the case because we know railroads incur substantial costs as well in regulatory rate reviews. The three benchmark tests, the shipper community perceives 3B as vague, requiring prolonged litigation over whether a shipper even qualifies to use them. And the most recent InterVista's report says on both the shipper side and the railroad sides, it's too complex and too costly relative to the expected benefits. So the research question that John and I were hoping to address in this paper is what has been the effect of STB rate reviews on railroads and shippers moving from common to contract carriage, if any? Does it vary by commodities that have been subject to rate reviews versus commodities that have not? In particular, coal, chemical versus non-coal, non-chemical. And does it vary by railroads that have undergone a rate review? And there's roughly 7 that have undergone a rate review. And so that's the sort of the main kinds of questions. We just want to see if there's any effect by commodities that have been rate reviewed and by railroads that have been rate reviewed in terms of contracting, okay? Now, if you use the STB rate review sample, publicly available on the STB website, this is the count of the number of rate reviews over time. So they start in 1996, and they peak in roughly 2009, and there's a lot of activity in 2003. But we can disaggregate the rate reviews, and the rate reviews can be disaggregated in multiple ways, one of which is by commodity. So here you see that chemical, coal, grain, and minerals have all had rate reviews, but to be honest, the action lies in chemicals and coal. So that's what we're going to look at in terms of commodities that have been affected by a rate review. It's either most typically coal or chemicals, and much more less so than grain and minerals, only once. You can also disaggregate the data by who the defendant is, and I don't mean this in any sense. This is how the STB reports their data. I'm just using their words. What you see is BNSF, CSX, Norfolk Southern, and UP have faced the majority of rate reviews, but there are others. Others include Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range, Grand Trunk, Louisiana Northwest, and I neglected Sioux, the Canadian Pacific subsidiary, which faced a rate review in 1999. And that is included in this other category. It's just not shown below. All right, so you're looking at roughly 7 different rate reviews that have 7 different railroads that have faced a rate review at some time. All right? Now, what I'm going to do is look at, let me go back. I'm going to look at how rate reviews have shifted contracting between railroads and between commodities. And what I'm going to use is what's called a difference in difference estimation. And you guys have seen some of that. Elvis, I think, showed some of that, and Hayu as well in some of his work. So this is effect of a treatment at a particular point in time on an outcome measure. And here my treatment is going to be a rate review. So we're going to look at average change over time before and after between commodities that have been reviewed and commodities that haven't, between railroads that have had one, between railroads that have not. And the way this normally works is the following. Pick whatever outcome measure you want. You're going to have a treatment group and a control group. At some point in time, the treatment is going to affect the treated group, but not the control group. And the idea is to look at what effect does the treatment have going forward after that treatment occurs. Now, what's different here is I actually have 2 treatments. I have a treatment on the type of commodity that's being shipped. Is it coal or chemical? Those are my treated groups. Those are the commodities that have seen a lot of rate reviews. And I also have treatments on which railroads were affected. So BNSF, CSX, Norfolk Southern, UP, Sioux, DMIR, Grand Trunk, and L&W. So those are all going to be affected, and then all the other railroads are not going to be affected. And I'm going to look at time before and after. So I'm going to pick 1999 as the time with which rate reviews really, quote unquote, came about. There was roughly 4 in a short amount of time. There are others, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, everybody with me? All right, so we can look at summary statistics over time. Oh, I'm sorry, my data comes from the STB carload-Weibull sample, unmasked version. I'm going to use data from 1990 to 2014. I'm going to throw away some of the earlier data. And I'm also going to drop railroads where their ton-mile market share in any commodity group is less than 0.1%. All right, so commodities, they don't represent sort of the lion's share of traffic in a given commodity group. I also use the rate review sample, which is publicly available. It provides information on the commodity, the defendant, the date of the ruling, and any outcome as well. Now, my outcome measure is the following. How much, as a percentage of ton miles, moved by contract carriage for railroad I by commodity code J in year T? All right, so it's a pretty simple difference of difference estimation. And just to give you a flavor of how it looks, so what you're seeing in red are coal and chemicals as a percentage of contract carriage via ton mile. and then in green, non-coal, non-chemical as a percentage. And what you see is coal chemical has a little bit higher percentage of contract carriage over time than non-coal, non-chemical. You can also cut the data a different way and look at for any railroad. So STB railroads would be any railroad over time that's been hit by a rate review, and like I said, there's 7 of these, versus the dozens that have not been hit by a rate review. And you can look at how they move ton miles via contract carriage or common carriage. And you see that tracks pretty closely, all right? So when I run the estimation, I'm not going to show you the results. I figured I'd only have a few minutes, and I'm only at 11 right now, James. Here's what the sample statistics show, and they're interesting and, to me at least, counterintuitive, and this is where I could use the help of industry practitioners to move me along. Now, what I'm going to show you is, let me explain it. You're looking at what a model, an econometric model, would predict for each category. So let me explain the category and the contracting percentage therein. So first, actually, let me look within a box. In an individual box, the little bar on the left is railroads that never faced a rate review. Railroads on the right are railroads that faced a rate review. Okay, and that's true in quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. If we compare quadrants 1 and 3, if you guys remember your Cartesian coordinate system, did I do that? No, I did that wrong. 1 and 2, right? 1 and 2, Russ, that's right. It's 1 and 2. All right, I don't remember my Cartesian coordinate system. Here's what we have, and this is what we're looking at. We're looking at non-coal, non-chemical, and we're going to compare it before 1999 and after 1999. And the little sticks represent confidence intervals of 95%. And what you see is a substantial increase in contracting in non-coal, non-chemical by both railroads that have been affected by a rate review and railroads that have not. And the numbers are pretty high. So we've gone from roughly 22% for railroads that never were affected, 24% for railroads that were, jumping all the way up to 53% and 65%. So there's a big movement up in non-coal, non-chemical by both railroads that have been affected by rate reviews and railroads that have not over time. If you look at coal chemical, they started contracting a little bit more. The numbers are here, about 28% and 37% pre-1999, 1990 to 1999. And then it jumps up to about 64%, all right? So big jumps in coal chemical as well, as you look at these results. Now, we could also look holding the commodity constant, holding the time constant and varying the commodity. So not surprisingly, there's a lot more contract carriage pre-1999 in coal chemical. But the more interesting one, and the one I want to focus on, is the non-coal chemical to coal chemical after. Notice the following. If you look at STB-affected railroads that underwent an STB rate review, they have very similar approaches to contract carriage. It's about 65% for non-coal, non-chemical, and about 64% for coal chemical. So when they form contracts, it doesn't really matter by commodity, at least at this breakdown. They tend to use contracts similar. However, the railroads that were never affected by a rate review, somewhat surprisingly, use less contract carriage in non-coal, non-chemical than they would in coal chemical. They mimic, if you will, the contracting approaches of firms that were affected by a rate review, and then take a different approach in the commodities that have never been affected. So let me sort of summarize that and say the following. Not surprisingly, contracting differences over time. You see a humongous increase in contracting over time by this demarcation of 1999 that I use, and it's pretty robust to other time periods as well. You see pretty strong differences by commodity as well. There's more in coal and chemical versus non-coal and chemical, both before and after, and that's in general. But the surprising thing, at least for me, was this, that there's contracting differences by freight rail post-STB rate reviews. So the STB rate-reviewed railroads, the 7 of them, take a very similar approach across commodities. It's about 65% on average is how they contract. However, the railroads that were never affected by a rate review directly take a very different approach. They tend to mimic in coal chemical what their competitors are doing, but take a very different approach. Not very different, but a pretty substantial difference. It's more than 11% different in the non-coal, non-chemical commodities. So the discussion that I would have, or what I'm hoping to get from you guys, is what explains this. Maybe the railroads that have been affected by STB rate reviews had to come down the learning curve in writing better contracts. And those contracts begin to spill over across other surface transportation commodity codes. They just write really good contracts. And it is conducive to both shippers and railroads for this, possibly. But the non-STB railroads seem to want to, they want to avoid rate review. So they're going to do some comparative adjustments, if you will, by avoiding rate reviews in specific commodities, coal, chemical, that tend to see more rate reviews. Or I could be off completely, and maybe it's the shippers that they just have preferences for contracts, that confidentiality and tailoring benefits that exist. Shippers might find this more conducive. So these are the open questions that I'm exploring with John. I got a bunch of next steps to do. I need to sort of think about several things here. It's pretty preliminary stuff. Different time windows. So for instance, 2003 and 4 had 7 rate reviews faced by 4 railroads. I could look at rate review outcomes. Right now I'm just saying I'm flagging a rate review, but you can imagine you might, if you're a railroad, do something different if the rate's found reasonable, if the rate's found unreasonable, or there's some type of settlement. Or I also need to throw in some more robustness analysis here. But that's sort of where I am. Unfortunately, I have 3 minutes left, and I was hoping to end this talk at 15. But I'm not gonna. So I'm gonna stop. Oh, sorry, and that's just a picture, I should say, of if you look at what the findings were by STB over time. So that's where I'm at. If you have thoughts as to how to approach this, what I'm doing, please email me or John, and I would appreciate it. Okay, thank you.